and I'm going to read a story called Mansfield House. Brigadier George Wilson raised a confident hand to speak. Of course, it reminds me of meeting Mr. Churchill. His face altered and became downcast as he grabbed his chin in confused recollection. It was either Plymouth or Southampton. Yes, Brigadier Wilson, we know you met Mr. Churchill. It's time for bingo. Take your seat. Come on, Georgie Porgy. Frank gripped George's upper arm and led him quick time across the floor of the common room. He shoved George onto a seat among the other elderly residents. The room had been a ballroom before Mansfield House was converted into a care home. It still had the marble fireplace and high windows facing onto the three-tiered garden. The wallpaper showed a tracery of vines with sparrows and starlings. The furniture was practical, as many of the faux leather chairs had restrainers to prevent people falling. The sliding sash windows had net curtains. The pictures suspended from the picture reel were a series of landscapes and cityscapes. The bookcase with paperbacks, CDs and DVDs was topped with a TV screen always on, like the ceiling lights. Nurse Rogers issued the bingo books and pens. With her usual smile to the residents, she made a flirtatious glance at Frank, who had sat at the table with the super select electronic bingo machine. She snapped each bingo book securely onto a blue clipboard and got everyone's attention with rebukes and reprimands. There you go, Josephine. You had a good bit of luck last week. Pauline, stop giggling and take your book. Anne, remember to clean your mouth after dinner. Use that hanky tucked up your sleeve. Don't spit on it. Wilfred, keep your hands to yourself. Oh dear, Brigadier George. Nurse Rogers placed the final clipboard on his lap, not impressed with the military man or his former rank. A door opened. George blinked, walking into the garden, his steps somnambulatory as he mounted the wheelchair ramp leading to a fountain. The ground was wet, his slippers were soon soaking. The lawn was the length of a bowling green. The laurel hedging swelled in growth that required pruning. Rhododendrons gone wild were for termination. Insect life in summer and late autumn threatened everyone outdoors. George arrived at the fountain feeling frail and fatigued. A flower and weed lured him to sniff it. Margaret liked flowers. Who was Margaret? If he touched this flower, maybe he would remember Margaret. George, Brigadier, a male voice bellowed. George pulled at the flower. George, the male voice again. Suddenly, a pain in his arm. I took a hit. Retreat to the ridge, hold back, defend the house. George cried out and stumbled forward. He bloody thinks he's at war, Frank laughed. Brigadier, enemy snipers, retreat in single file, Frank said mockingly as George tried to resist his grip. George, Nurse Rogers shouted, Frank needs to get you inside. Frank pulled George harder and he fell onto the wet grass. I'm not going to make it. His face was frightened as he appealed for their help to lift him. They did, but roughly. My father's face is bruised. George Jr. was distraught at Nurse Rogers, who held a bundle of medical reports. Your father fell out of bed again, she replied. Isn't that right, Brigadier? The bed rails were raised and George stared at the ceiling. My father's in bed in the middle of the afternoon. He's been asleep on and off all day and refused to attend our gala bingo. Nurse Rogers' voice was harsh. You can't lock him up like this. And he fell during a walk outdoors after lunch, she said stolidly as Frank entered the room. Surely there's supervision. George Jr. turned to Frank, who leaned by the door. It's for his own safety. He's a handful, Frank grunted. Mr. Wilson, I understand your distress, but Mansfield House is the highest standards. Your father is a particular high risk. His dementia is not only a danger to himself, but the other residents. Pigs, muttered the brigadier. What's that, Dad? Mr. Churchill shook my hand. That's right, Dad. George Jr. took his father's hand. Did I tell you what he said? Brigadier, George's eyes were wide. I know what Churchill said, Dad. You told me about the pigs and the cats and the dogs. Churchill told you that dogs look up to us, cats look down on us, pigs treat us as equals. No, Brigadier cried out. Pigs treat you like pigs.